So welcome to this week's days, months, years webcast with Bill and John. Or I guess I say John and Bill since that's the order it is on the slides. I hope everybody's having a good time. This is part of the Professionally Evil webcast series. And today, John and Bill, two of our senior consultants here, will be presenting about practical tips to secure your business. And the goal and focus that they're going to deal with is on things that small businesses can do without breaking the bank, with it, whatever. And I want to be very clear. I've talked to them. I've looked at what they're presenting, and they've got some really good ideas. Plus, they're two of the smartest people I know. No pressure for them. But what they're talking about is stuff that you often see in large corporations, but in ways that you can implement it in small businesses. So I'm gonna stop talking now and turn it over to them. John, Bill, have a good one.
Thanks, Kevin. And because my name was first on the slide, I'm going to go ahead and be first to talk. Next time, maybe we'll do it alphabetical. In full disclosure, I kind of took first crack at the slides, so I win.
By default, right?
Faster, he could have been first, Bill. So we've stared at this title page a little too long. Let's switch it over. I'm going to introduce myself. I'm John Knepp. I joined Secure Ideas back in 2020 after a 25 plus year career in systems administration, IT management, system architecture. So really, I spent a lot of time companies large and small, essentially the same folks that we're targeting this at today, sharing the benefit of our years of experience out there on how you too can work on implementing a cybersecurity program, addressing some of those risks out there that keep us all awake at night. So when I started at Secure Ideas, I was based in Denver. Back at the end of 2021, I made the move for the benefit of my wife's career to Salt Lake City. We've been here for going on 2 years now, a year and a half, if I'm being honest. It's still a bit of a culture shock, but seeing as how I never leave my house, I don't see much different on a day-to-day basis. And I still see all the same lovely faces at work. So I'm happy with that. So on a personal note, I spend a lot of time with my primary office companion, which is my little dog, who was just a little short time ago sitting next to me. He's a great office company, not so great a conversationalist. So I do tend to ramble on when I get an opportunity with a captive audience like this to spend far too much time talking. And then my other hobby, when I'm not busy with work, I'm busy thinking or doing or just plain drinking beer. I'm a home brewer, thankfully. That is something that I have in common with my colleague here, Bill. So I'm going to let Bill tell you all about himself. He's not as single-faceted as I am when it comes to those personal hobbies.
Let's see. Hi, everyone. My name is Bill McCauley. I've actually been with Secure Ideas for about I'm in my 6th year now, so it's just recently. Finished up year 5, moving into year 6. And I'm actually in the Dallas DFW area. Not in Dallas, but outside of. In fact, when it says remote there on the screen, it is literally very, very, very remote. In fact, I'm sitting on about 9 acres over here with cows, no cows any longer, but chickens and other stuff. And so the nearest town to where I'm at, and you may see my videos freeze every now and then, upload speeds are not all that great out here. But by remote, the nearest town is population 3,000, and I'm outside of that. So nice to be able to disconnect every now and then. My background really includes a lot of different things, from electronics in the military to avionics to communication navigation systems to healthcare IT. I even did a stint as a NERC coordinator, compliance coordinator. And if you're familiar with NERC for compliance, I apologize. It was actually pretty good. I surprisingly, for the type of work that we do for the penetration testing, the architecture reviews, the assessments, all of those types of things, it's actually really amazing to me, looking back on it, how much of that time in compliance carries over into this. Just because you're all, like any organization, small, medium, large, and at some point is going to deal with some sort of regulatory body, some sort of compliance, some sort of standard or requirement. And so I actually look back on that. While I didn't so much enjoy the work, I learned a lot of it, and a lot that's useful in my day-to-day stuff. Other items of interest, US Vet, Air Force, also homebrewing, not quite to the degree John is, but picked it up a couple of years back and absolutely loved it. So it's an enjoyable hobby. It's an enjoyable pastime. Do some snowboarding. I've got kids getting out of the house now. They're just about that age. But aside from that, that's probably good for me. Oh, I've got pictures of the beard. That actually, you can't see it much on camera right now, but it's down there quite a ways. And if you ever see me shave that bottom picture, that's exactly what I'm going to look like. Sorry.
Bill, you don't have your other hobby that I wouldn't have the bravery to do myself, and that's the forge that you had.
Oh, I didn't put that in there, did I?
No.
So, yeah, interesting story about that. I was watching a few episodes of Forged in Fire and said, I can do that. And so before you know it, I had done some forging. So that's kind of how my interests run. That looks fun. Let me go try it.
Yeah, you've got way more going on in your life. I don't blame you for not brewing as often as I do, seeing as how I don't have any other responsibilities or kids at home. So,
oh yeah,
you're excused. All right.
Let's hop into this. So as we move into this, one of the focuses when me and John were talking about this was coming at this from the perspective of, why are you here? What caused you to attend? Was there a security event someplace? What keeps you up at night in your day-to-day job? Are you the one dealing with the IT, the security, or the response to any incidents that may pop up? Is this a new business? Is this a compliance requirement? Those are the kind of things that as we were talking about, wanted to hop in and just get an idea of where people were coming from, what this would look, and to keep that in mind as we go forward. Because ultimately, and John, correct me if you have any thoughts on this as well, but as we go forward with this, even though people are coming from different directions, either say a management-based or an IT-based background, there is a lot of overlap in those areas. And keep those things in mind when we start looking at how do you consider what your risk is. Is it something that's really going to be an existential? I can't even speak that today. Existential risk.
Because your video is freezing.
Oh, is that what it is?
Your mouth just can't keep up.
Sounds logical to me. So,
yeah,
but yeah,
existential threat, right? What
go.
Types of what is the existential threat to your business? What things would essentially mean the end of operations for you?
Yep. And
right?
That would be the thread. And this is focused on small to medium businesses. In a lot of these cases, the things from a management perspective, you want to be thinking of, what are the core functions of your business, right? If you lost this, how long could your business survive? If you're coming at it from an IT-based background, a lot of this is going to be focused on, how do I keep these core systems up and running? The problem comes when those two objectives are not always well aligned. Does that sound about right, Don?
Yeah, I was going to kind of say that if depending on what your role is, right, especially if you're in IT and you don't necessarily have that tight connection to leadership and what their objectives, what their fears are, that's where a lot of the stress comes in, right? You're worried about things down here, and maybe the stress is you can't convince the people higher up that that needs attention. And this is true whether you're medium or large. Maybe it's a little less true in some of the really small companies because you're close enough. You should know what the real drivers are, what's really important in your organization, but maybe there's not enough communication. But the point being, if you're not on the same page about what's important, what the real threats to your business are from a operational, from a viability standpoint, then you're not going to be able to prioritize the IT layer that's in support of those goals, those or protecting against those risks. We can't, that triangle of what do you want to do, cost versus time versus quality. You have to be able to balance that out, and it's the same thing is true in managing risk. You have to make sure that you're applying your efforts to that aspect of securing your business, protecting your business appropriately, or you're just spinning your wheels. So
yeah, and it's difficult when you're not pulling all in the same direction too.
Yeah. So let's move on. The key point here is we are bombarded almost daily with all these reports about well-funded large organizations that are, suffering attacks. They've been breached, what have you. We hear about it constantly. For those organizations that are smaller, maybe small to medium budgets, you realize that it's a scary world out there, but you don't have the resources to be able to deploy the same things at the same level of protections as some of the bigger guys, right? You don't have full-time staff in some cases to dedicate it to it. So what can you do?
Yeah. Resources are a lot less. And just because you're small does not mean that you might not be affected by these things. A lot of the things we're going to cover are going to be foundational to any organization, regardless of their size. And these basic controls really are going to be universal to anyone out there getting started.
Yep. All right, moving to the next one. Go. So cybersecurity risks. This slide basically is highlighting some of the categories of cybersecurity risk, and depending on what line of business you're in, what's important to your company, some of these may be bigger threats, more important to protect against than others, right? Individuals are going to care about identity theft. The kind of public face of your company is important, or is web defacement or denial of service. What impact is that going to have on your customer base, right? If your reputation is tarnished, how bad is that? How big of an impact is that going to be for you?
Yeah, and that's a good point, because the maturity of your organization and the maturity of your security program is going to make a difference in this, right? As well as the value and the usability of your data. A good example of this, touching on, say, financial information. There's a curve there that if you're dealing with financial controls, you think of a larger bank. They have more money, more resources to put into securing those things, so their controls are far more mature. But then if you've got something, say, in a healthcare environment, normally the amount of resources available are not as much. And we're going to touch on this off and on throughout the entire presentation here. This is one reason why, say, credit card compromises are usually caught really quickly. But something like healthcare, because of the data, it's not just numbers, right? It's not just some control says, oh, we're going to lock out the card and now no one can access it. Now you're dealing with socials, you're dealing with identity theft, because the flexibility of, say, healthcare data, less controls, there's a higher probability of someone being able to use that for more than just one thing, right? more than just trying to get a bank account. Now you're dealing with your identities, you're dealing with prescriptions, you're dealing with all kinds of other things that are tied to your actual identity. So when you think of risk, it can encompass a lot of different areas, a lot of different aspects. I actually did a data protection class recently, and one of the stats that came out of that was in the third quarter, just last year of 2022, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, had over 260,000 reports of identity theft. And that's just what was reported. That's not counting anything that might have been not reported at that time. So when you start looking at those risks, keep those in mind, because those are going to play a part. Some of these may directly affect you and your organization or your business.
Yep. All right. I'm going to advance it because you started talking about stats.
Yeah. So I like this slide because there's a couple things that I want to highlight as in part of this. Now, this is actually taken from the Verizon DBIR, summary of findings, small to medium businesses.
Released this year.
Released this year, 2023. This is hot off the press. And one of the things that it makes mention of is this, that small and medium businesses, as well as large companies, because they're using similar services, similar infrastructure, they've got their Active Directory, right? They are using AWS, or they're tied into Azure, right? They're using something, and a lot of these underlying platforms, underlying services are now they have more in common between small and large businesses when it comes to the tools, software platforms that are being used. Because of that, if you start looking at some of these comparisons, when I first saw this, my first thought was there would be a much wider gap between your small businesses and your Fortune 500, right? Your much larger businesses that were there. But because of that commonality with the software platforms, tools that are being used, attackers, when they're working on one, it doesn't matter to them the size of the company unless there's a targeted attack, right? But that's led to a convergence, so to speak, of similarities between attack profiles. You'll notice here between the frequency of incidents, that's not a big gap from 496 to 600, 700. That's not a big difference. You go down to data compromises, credentials, maybe a 20% spread. That's probably one of the biggest spreads between the small and large. And maybe that's just because there's more targets within a large environment. So the reasons for some of these stats, difficult to know without digging into more of the report statistics. But just looking across the board, there's very little difference between the percentages and the numbers between the smaller and larger. In fact, when it's discussing these smaller businesses, normally this is dealing with, say, you're a tiny business, maybe a startup, there's limited resources. Those things play a factor in what controls you're able to actually roll out. Your IT person is probably just one person who is also your security person who wears other hats and probably never sleeps. Whereas if you're a medium business, typically this is a situation where you've got a few controls in place. You've been at this for a little bit of time. You're not quite small, but you still don't have quite the same resources as one of the larger companies or the manpower, because manpower is a resource to deal with. And so keep those things in mind, again, as we get into some of the later slides, the differences between what is, the resources available based on your size. But yeah, the biggest part of this, the takeaway, is the gap between small to larger businesses when it comes to the attack surface is not nearly as big as you might think it would be. And a lot of that is simply due to the commonality of tools and services that we're using overall.
And that's a relatively new trend because you see a lot more of the sort of cloud related services like Office 365, right? Before Office 365 was out there, the small and medium businesses may have had their own on-prem mail server, or they may have relied on something like, a non-commercial solution that just didn't have the same level of control that larger organizations were able to provide with their internal mail systems, for example. So this move to cloud, and that's actually one of the big selling features of cloud is now you too, small businesses, can get the functionality, the capability that was only previously available in to the people that had economy of scale, right? Didn't make sense for a small business to try and implement these solutions because it was too costly. But when you're able to do it as sort of a managed service, that's a lot easier to defray, to spread those costs out, make it more affordable. So
everybody's looking for efficiency and all of those things.
So this is an interesting kind of trend. Small, what used to be our take on the capabilities available to small businesses and the disparity there. There's, as Bill mentioned, there's a convergence going on. It's not full convergence, but there is a convergence.
Across the streams.
Yeah. So I think this is a good point, a good place to say, look, if you're looking to implement something, and really part of the intended audience for this would be those folks that are trying to figure out how to start this journey, how to improve or at least feel comfortable with their cybersecurity program, or get started with one, or know how, try and figure out how they can improve things. The question is always, where do we start, right? What is it that we need? How do we begin to develop this program? There are still a lot of small companies out there, which probably by far vastly outnumber the large companies, where people need to get this set up, and they might not have dedicated staff to do this. There might be business individuals that are tasked with this. So we're hoping that this will help be that intro that will enable them to take the next step and work on their cybersecurity program. So the first step in any discussion on developing a cybersecurity program should be, what do we value?
Yeah. What do you value?
Know what's important to your company, what needs to be protected, what is the existential threat. You won't know where to start. You won't know how to prioritize these things, and there's a lot of controls out there to consider. There's a lot of things, threats out there to worry about, but you need to start and be very tactical about how you build towards the things that are most impactful to you. Because I will say this again as we go through, it is not a simple project that you have a start and a finish on. Don't be discouraged. It will be a constant process. It needs to become something that you build into your operational mentality. Security is not a put it in and forget it. It is a part of risk management.
Yeah, and this is going to mature over time, which means it's going to be updated, it's going to be tweaked, it's going to be changed. One thing to remember about this, where you start, this is not typically for one person to make. This is normally a combination of your management, your C-level, your IT group, your security group, your legal group, multiple departments coming together to discuss these things, because each person is going to have a part, and the parts that your one area might find as critical or important may not impact one of the others, right? You're going to have different groups, different goals, different focuses from department to department, but you need to use that together and not just one person from one simple split, because you're looking at the entire organization. You're not looking at just your department.
And for those people that have spent their career in IT or are making a career in IT, the biggest part of your stress, regardless of whether or not you're directly involved in security or not, but if you're in IT and you're frustrated with the fact that you are dealing with systems and can't get management to pay attention to problems with certain systems, it's because of that disconnect between what's important to the business and what's important to IT. And if you don't have those conversations to level set and make sure everybody is focused on delivering the value that's needed, and it's a conversation both ways, then you're always going to be at loggerheads. So, all right. The guided journey. So we've been talking about what to take to get there. How do you build this? Well, you know what? You don't have to create it from nothing. You don't have to think of everything. There are a lot of sort of best practice frameworks out there where people have already boiled it down and said, here are the elements that you need to have in order to protect your systems, to manage risk. And one of those frameworks that's been around for quite some time, or based on the evolution of very early frameworks, is the CIS Controls. And it's just a recommended set of actionable action items that can be used to essentially protect against modern cyber attacks, modern dangers and risks. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that here. All right. So this slide's got a couple of things going on it. I'll kind of cover quickly. I've alluded to the fact that the framework we're going to talk about, the CIS Controls. By the way, that stands for Center for Internet Security. Centers for Internet Security. The controls that they are maintaining, are actually evolved from the SANS top 20 critical security controls. Now, if you're old like me, you will remember the SANS top 20, but it's been a while since it was called SANS. We are now, as of 2021, already on version 8 of the CIS Controls. It used to be 20 up until 2021 when they reworked them, and now they're on version 8. We are now down to only 18 critical security controls. And they're not just 18 controls. You don't have just a list to implement all these and you're good. They are essentially a group of controls and sub-controls. And we will talk a bit more in general about them. We're not going to cover every one in this discussion, so we're not going to bore you with those details. Really, the interesting thing is that they came out with, in the more recent iterations, I think it was in 7.1, was it, Bill, that they came out with the concept of implementation groups?
Somewhere along there, yes.
Yeah, so it's been in the last couple generations of the CIS Controls where they were actually, like, they realized that people were looking at these and thinking, I have to implement every one of these controls. Nope, that's not, and all the sub controls too. That's not necessarily the case. They realize they've got some of them that are meant for, not every control fits all organizations, right? Yeah. If you're not doing internal app development, you don't really need to focus on the control that deals with application development and application security. You're outsourcing that, right, from whatever software that you're purchasing to use in-house. So you don't have to worry about that. The implementation group is broken out into 3 different groups, and it basically kind of breaks down for each of the controls and sub-controls. It breaks down which ones are considered essential, implementation group 1, for all organizations, and they call that kind of basic cyber hygiene. And then implementation group 2 is for those organizations with a little more
they've been there a little bit. They got a few
more security requirements. Actually, I do believe we have a slide on this, so I should wait and we can do more details. So there are 3 groups. I do want to point out on here the chart on the right. We've got, that's the version 7 of the CIS Controls on the left, and the version 8 on the right. This kind of showing a remapping there as they went from 20 to 18. But one thing that stayed consistent is that these controls are kind of broken into kind of three groups. One is about what we'll talk about in more depth, but we've got the controls about knowing knowing your environment, the controls about protecting your environment, and the controls dealing with preparing or essentially policy related. So they're different categories of controls as you kind of progress down the list. That theme we'll talk about a little bit more here next.
Actually, have a quick
Sure.
note on this one. We've been talking about the good cyber hygiene, right? The essential cyber hygiene for the CISC. Through all of these studies, right? If you go look at the reports, if you go read some of the statistics, you start looking at some of the breach information. A lot of reports, a lot of studies have come back with the same basic results. In a lot of these cases, that in most of those successful attacks, those attacks take advantage of conditions that could be described as poor hygiene. Things like not patching your known vulnerabilities, or if you've got bad configuration management, or overly permissive admins, failure to tier your administrative environments or accounts. So there's a lot of things like that when we deal with hygiene. This right here, which is going to map directly to IG1, and specifically for the purpose of making sure that small, medium businesses in particular who have limited resources can implement those things.
Yeah. All right. So I've already kind of covered over a little bit on this slide. I'll just reiterate a bit again. So IG1 is your cyber hygiene essential controls. This is for businesses that are small. They use commercial off-the-shelf software, and their environments are kind of low data sensitivity, right?
Yep.
As you move up, and you might have more specialized kind of compliance requirements, or you're kind of larger, you begin to have a dedicated team associated, or dedicated individuals, maybe even a team of people associated with managing security, and there are specific requirements that they're tasked with protecting at the company because of that elevated risk. That's where you're going to get into the implementation group 2 controls, and then implementation group 3. This is a very small sector of businesses that really, highest tiers, where you're going to see these types of controls, that they have those types of requirements. So you can think companies like Google and Apple and big boys, and people that have high security, high sensitivity industries.
Yeah, and it actually just crossed my mind that just because someone is a large business does not necessarily mean that they're going to have everything right lined up, all their ducks in a row. Because we've been on some of these larger jobs, and some of the outward perimeter is really hard. But once you get inside, there's so much to maintain, so much to manage. Their size actually works against them sometimes in situations like that.
Yeah.
So there's a balance between how mature the organization is security-wise and how well they can maintain it, and their size becoming just large and unwieldy. So that is a consideration when you start thinking of how to be efficient with your resources, your time, and how you implement things.
Yeah, and just because something is in IG Group 2 doesn't mean that if you're not done with IG Group 1, you shouldn't bother doing things in IG Group 2. Again, it's dependent upon your business, This is a process, right? This is a cyclical, a constant refinement. You aren't going to necessarily perfect every single one of the controls in every implementation group, and you don't have to do that in order to build into the next implementation group, right? It's just that's a level of maturity that as you progress up the level of maturity, you will start to see more and more things from implementation group 2 eking into that environment, and maybe some things poking into implementation group 3. But master the basics. By all means, that should be where the priority is at.
Yeah, that's our main focus today. IG 2 and 3 can go on the roadmap.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So we mentioned this before, phased implementation. So again, this is targeted at those folks that are trying to get into this, right? They don't have an established cybersecurity program. How do you get going? What are the things, this is a mountain of information for a lot of people, right? How do you get started? How possibly can you make a dent in what appears to be something insurmountable? Well, you know what? Just put one step and then take another step and then take another step. So this is a phased implementation. So the first step here is know your environment. And we'll talk more about that, but there's many facets to that. But step one is know your environment. Step two is protect your assets, right? Again, ask that question before. What do you value?
Yep.
You have to know your environment. You have to know what you're protecting, and then you can actually put in place the controls needed to protect that. And then the third phase of implementation is, we call it prepare here, but that's as much about creating policies, creating plans, making sure that you've documented all of this, that you have that you're disseminating the knowledge necessary for people to not only maintain the process and grow that process. Make sure people know who to talk to when something doesn't look right. Who are you going to communicate in the event that you do have a data breach and you're hacked, right? Do you know what steps are next? Don't just stop at, well, I've implemented these tools and we've changed all the permissions, so we're good. It's what's next. So that's where the prepare comes in. And it may seem out of order because you think prepare is what you do at the beginning, but really this is, Bill and I were talking about it yesterday. Know is know your enemy. Protect is put in place those protections that you're going to use for the enemy when the enemy attacks. And then prepare is everybody get up, muster yourself and be ready to fend off the borders, so to speak. So. All right, Bill, I'll let you.
I was going to say some of the questions as you get into this area, we're going to focus first on phase one, which is knowing. This because first of all, you can't protect if you don't know what's there, right? If you don't know what your network looks like, if you don't know what your footprint looks like, if you don't know what devices are there or what systems you've got, you have no way to realistically believe that you're able to protect it if you don't know what's there. And so part of that is you have to know what's connected to your network, what those boundaries look like, and we'll get into detection later. But first, know about that. Learn what's there, a lot of mapping. This may be, if you have tools or if you don't have tools, this could be a tedious part of the entire process. Do you know what software is installed on your systems? What software is allowed to be installed? What about your networks? What's allowed to run there? Do you know where your most important data is being stored? So when you go to protect things, and this goes back to basic data protection, you protect it at the level of its criticality. A good example of that is when you look at like top secret information. If it's top secret, by nature, you're going to protect it to a higher degree. If it's public information, by nature, you're not going to protect it nearly as stringently as you would secret or top secret. And so when you start looking at understanding what your environment looks like, this will actually lead into the next piece of this. But first, you have to know what's there.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to click over to the next slide because this is more, and all of this, we're being fairly abstract with this because this is not a one size fits all. Depending on your resources, you may go out and buy some software to do your asset inventory, or you may be small enough, or you may lack those resources. You might just be doing, keeping a spreadsheet, or you could just get a kind of a PowerShell script or something. Depending on your tech savviness, you might have something else that actually does your inventory for you. But what we're giving you are kind of actionable items here to get started. And you can mature that as you go and grow, right? Don't let a lack of resources or a lack of funding for the preferred software out there that you've heard some other guy has. Don't let that stop you from getting started on it, right? Some idea, some inventory, even if it's not real time, of what you have in your environment is better than nothing. It is a place to start and a place to build that foundation of these other controls on. So your step one is inventory. Maintain an inventory of not just the hardware. You need to know what assets should be connected to your network, but also what software is allowed and expected to be on those systems, right? So you can't control it if you don't know what is supposed to be there. That's inventory. You catalog your data as Bill was saying. You need to know where your data is being kept and what data is considered sensitive, so that you can make sure that if you see sensitive data and it's in the wrong place, that gets corrected, right? And make sure that people know where that's supposed to go. But if you don't have it defined, that's really hard for people to comply with that and for you to manage it. So it needs to be defined first, then catalog it, make sure you know where it's supposed to be, what's producing it and what's consuming it. And then there's a cycle of make sure that you've got a plan in there to go back and repeat that inventory, refresh that inventory on a periodic basis. Maybe you don't have time to do that every week, every month, but at very least you want to be looking at this stuff once a year, and hopefully hardware and software once a quarter, if not more.
Yeah, maintain it as best you can, especially if you're doing it manually, but keep it update and make that periodic review. Make that happen.
Build it into your process, right? If you're deploying, if you're a guy that's responsible for giving the new employees their equipment, make sure you jot all that stuff down, keep a record of it before you hand it to them. That's important. Otherwise,
one thing. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, otherwise, when the guy leaves, you're not sure you got everything back, and that poses a little bit of a security risk if it's a laptop that's had company data on it, right?
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, this is a framework, and I forgot to mention this earlier, that as a framework, this is a guideline for you to go by, not a hard, fast rule. These controls are considered to be the basic security hygiene to implement. But when you start looking at what you're implementing, how you do it, look for efficiencies. Look for things that you can combine under the same initiatives, right? Look for places where you can get the most out of the effort and resources you're pouring into this. And find creative solutions to your problem, even if it doesn't exactly match someone else's or another business that you're comparing to. That was it. This is a framework, and this is meant to be a guideline. So use it with its flexibility, but also make sure that it meets the actual goal that those IGs are intended to meet.
Yeah. And Bill, you mentioned control. I'm just going to assume that I'm going to chalk it up that we talked about control, but this slide also talks about the other aspect is inventory, and then you can control, right? If you don't know what's supposed to be there, you can't remove, detect and remove unauthorized devices or software. If you don't know what critical assets and data you've got that needs to be protected, you can't restrict appropriately the access to that data. You can't prevent people from being able to access it that don't have a legitimate need. And then logging is how you keep track and audit that those controls are effective. So,
yep.
All right, exactly. Let's click over to protecting, because we're 15 minutes before the hour. So
we got
15 minutes. All right. I'll let you take this.
Okay. So part of protecting your assets, these are the kind of things you want to consider about when you first set your computers up. Do you have them built with security? Do you have a gold standard? Do you have an image that you're using that has the latest updates so that when you deploy your devices, when you deploy your workstations, they all have the same basic configuration? Do you have that in mind? That's part of what this is meant to address. These are some of the questions that you want to be asking yourself to get you further along that security path, that maturity level. Do you manage who has access to sensitive information? Have you restricted based on need to know, least privilege? Have you looked at those areas? Have you made lists of, right? Have you kept track of who has elevated rights on your network, on your machines, on your servers across your network? Do you educate your users? Do you have awareness training that is ongoing? Because I'll tell you right now, people in general, but users are very, very forgetful. And so just because they had one 30-minute CBT or a computer-based training someplace does not mean that they are going to remember that. But if you have some sort of ongoing, just small bits, just small bites of information related to cybersecurity, users tend to respond to that more. So keep those in mind. These are some of the questions you want to ask about, hey, when you're starting to implement your security controls, what about my computers? What about my users? What about my environment? What about rights and privileges? What about the awareness of my users? So those are some of the core things you want to start with, and from there it will expand naturally. Let's run to the next one.
Yep. So this slide, phase 2 activities broken into secure and then inform, right? And I think you got that from some of the questions that are being asked, right? Start you thinking about the things that, the questions in general that need to be asked that are really relevant, right? It's about relevancy to your organization. Those earlier questions get you thinking. Here are the things, the actions that you can take. And regardless of what your organization is, these are fairly generic and will build your capability, right? So establish a secure baseline configuration. In general, when we say this, we're like the first thing that comes to mind is for your workstations, right? When you hand somebody a new laptop, what did you do to that laptop to ensure that what that user is going to do with it, or what would happen to that laptop if it fell into somebody outside's hands? What did you do to secure that? If you didn't do anything, you probably have a little bit higher risk than if you were to take some time and make sure that laptop meets certain security basics, essential baseline configuration for your organization. So establish the secure baseline configuration. That isn't just for laptops. You can do the same thing for servers and applications. Figure out what that is. And it's evolving, right? None of this are you expected to know right out of the gate. You're going to say, hey, look, I read that maybe it's not a good idea for me to allow people to plug USB drives into a laptop because then they might be infected. They might infect their laptop, or maybe they could copy important files that I don't want them copying to that USB. And oops, they leave it on the table in the coffee shop, and now somebody has these sensitive files in there. Just a couple of examples. So you decide that you want to disable USB, the ability for users to connect a USB device to their device, to their laptop. This is just one example there. Ensure that operating systems, browsers, anti-malware are kept up to date. So patching, right? We talked about that earlier.
Patching.
Adopt strong password policies and multi-factor authentication if and when available. This is basic cybersecurity hygiene right there that really does, as Bill pointed out, you have to engage and educate the user base, because at the end of the day, even if you have the strongest, most expensive software on your network, if your user base isn't educated about it, they're going to do something They're going to find a way to make their life easier, and in doing so, they may end up compromising all those efforts you've taken towards hardening your systems against attack. Yeah. Or they're going to fall for phishing, social engineering. You really need to work on user education to make sure that you've covered over the element you can't control, and that's the human element. And then use encryption on sensitive systems and data and communications. Make sure you're encrypting that data at rest, in transit. And then inform. And this is, again, back to cybersecurity awareness, making sure that everybody needs to know what the expectations are of them, what's important in order to protect the company's assets.
There was one thought that came to mind when we were looking at the strong password policies, multi-factor authentication. Just because something is a simple control does not mean that it's effective. And a really brief story. I was on a pen test, and the IT team, the technical team, had done an amazing job of locking down, tiering out their access and their administrators. But because they were weak on their password policies and multi-factor authentication, even though I had no elevated rights on the network to like servers, domain controllers, anything like that, I still had access to half of their executive suite, right? Through email, through passwords, without multi-factor authentication across multiple accounts for the execs. And so just because someone does not have the access to your technical servers and backups, whatever, doesn't mean that other information is not going to be useful. Because even though they don't have access to their servers, they have all of the business information that they could ever need. And so keep in mind, when you're looking at the risk, it's not just a technical risk. There's other information, right? There's other pieces of this that are going to be important. So don't underestimate the value of something as simple as MFA or strong password policies.
Something we haven't listed on here, but it may, I think it's implied, and I'm going to highlight that when I talk about establishing a baseline configuration, and you know, the patching and password policies. There's an implication here that you're having to keep some record, some documented process here that you will carry forward, right? If you're going to have any consistency, if you're going to be able to implement this continuously, across all systems being deployed, you're going to be able to communicate it to your users. You need to have documentation, document the process. And I'm going to flip the slide here because I think we get a little bit into this. Well, okay, maybe not yet, but keep in mind, this does require that you actually be creating some documentation and developing these processes so that people know what's expected, right? You know what to do in these cases, because if you can't repeat it because it's not documented, you're going to have failures.
Yeah. This is where you want to verify that, make sure you know where your backups are at, and you actually test what you can restore. Just because you backed it up does not necessarily mean that you're able to restore it or that you won't run into issues. Test those processes out, test those procedures. Verify that those are working as you expect them to. And if you have an incident, do your users know who to contact? Even if they don't know what to do specifically, do they know who to contact to get that type of information? Right? You want to make sure that those things are constantly, periodically, either month by month, quarter by quarter, something. We have fire drills for that exact reason, right? So that when the event actually happens, people know at least where to go, what to do, and who to look to.
I'm going to just throwing out here the concept of tabletop exercise. This is a great time to talk about it because you are preparing, you're trying to well, I'm going to flip the slide too. the idea here is you're planning and preparing, right? You're planning for events. You're planning for a possible need in the future. Hope you never need it, but if you do, you want to make sure it works. So the concept here is you're creating the plan, then you test the plan, and then you make adjustments to make sure that plan, that any gaps in your plan that were identified during testing are corrected, so that if you ever need to implement the plan, you're not completely derailed partway through. So the tabletop exercise is a great way to do that. You conceptually step through, and don't cut any corners there. You conceptually step through what you're going to need. So in the event of a failure, you lose a server, lose a domain controller, for instance, and then you need to do a restore. Well, if that restore requires that you authenticate with the domain controller and the domain controller is offline, and now all of a sudden you can't do your restore, you've got a chicken and an egg scenario. So make sure you think through those concepts of the scenario where you know that you've actually validated that you will be able to complete those steps.
Critical dependencies. You got your main business functions, and then you've got the critical dependencies that those main servers depend on.
Yep. So the other thing I want to highlight, so this slide, we're going to go through it very quickly. It's plan, and that means you need to know what your process is going to be in the event of incidents. You need to know who's going to be involved in addressing those incidents. Who you're going to call when something breaks. Who is taking the point, right? Because if you just kind of leave it as a collective think, people are going to assume that somebody else has got it. It's not going to go over well. You need to have named people responsible for these things, and you need to make sure that any contact information that you're going to need in the event or in the event you need to bring other people in or make a communication to, say, law enforcement, know what those numbers are in advance. You don't want to be scrambling when tensions are high, trying to figure out where you're going to make these contacts, who needs to be contacted. Document it in advance, add it to your plan, and then make sure your plan is somewhere that if the systems are offline, you can get to it. Maybe a physical hard copy.
All right, last slide.
Quick.
Yeah.
Yep. Guys, I want to say thank you so much for this. I feel like you produced a ton of really good guides to point people in the right direction. Of course, I'm biased. I like both of you. So I want to say thank you, everybody, for attending. If you're listening to the recording, appreciate you taking the time to do that. We've got some upcoming training that's listed on the slide. If you want to reach John or Bill, their email addresses are there. And they also have some resources that you can go follow up to get more information. Guys, thank you very much. I think this was excellent. I really appreciate it.
If I had
a good day.
If I had thought I had Kevin, I would have put Nathan's address in there instead of mine.
You should have. Yeah,
Nathan
at securideas.com is absolutely who you should be emailing all questions to. So thank you very much, everybody. Enjoy yourself, and see you on our next webcast.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.